Admiral Kefvar stood on the bridge of the flagship Sovereign's Wrath, his 6 eyes scanning the tactical display with growing satisfaction. 500 of the Galactic Federation's most advanced battlecruisers stretched out before him in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming under the light of the binary star system. Each vessel carried enough firepower to glass a small moon, and, together they represented the largest military force assembled in 3 centuries. All for one human. "Sir, we're receiving final confirmations from the fleet commanders," reported Lieutenant Zexai, her tentacles dancing across the communication console. "All ships report ready for jump to the target system." Kefvar's mandibles clicked with amusement. The Federation Council had declared this operation excessive, but they hadn't witnessed what he had seen in the Outer Rim territories. They hadn't watched entire star systems go dark, their defense fleets vanishing without so much as a distress signal. They hadn't studied the wreckage of ships torn apart by weapons that defied all known physics. The human called himself Marcus Chen, though intelligence suggested that might not be his real name. He operated alone, piloting a ship that seemed to shift and change depending on who observed it. Some scouts reported a sleek fighter no larger than a civilian transport. Others described a massive dreadnought bristling with unknown weapons. The only consistent detail was its pilot, a single human male who had somehow acquired technology that made the Federation's best ships look like primitive toys. "Admiral," called Science Officer Veltar from his station, "I'm still reading unusual quantum fluctuations from the target coordinates. Whatever that human is using for propulsion, it's unlike anything in our databases." Kefvar nodded grimly. 3 months ago, Marcus Chen had intercepted a Federation supply convoy carrying experimental weapons to the research facility on Kepler 442b. Instead of destroying the ships or stealing the cargo as expected, he had done something far more disturbing. He had scanned each vessel thoroughly, downloaded their entire databases, and then simply vanished. The convoy crews reported that their weapons systems had been completely disabled during the encounter, but no shots had been fired. 2 weeks later, a patrol fleet of 12 destroyers had attempted to corner Chen near the Vega system. When reinforcements arrived 6 hours later, they found the destroyers drifting in space, their crews alive but unconscious. Every computer system had been wiped clean, and strange modifications had been made to their engines. The ships could still fly, but their power output had somehow been increased by 30%. That was when the Federation realized they weren't dealing with a simple pirate or rogue agent. This human was studying them, learning their technology, and improving upon it. Every encounter made him stronger while revealing more of the Federation's weaknesses. "Targeting solutions locked in, Admiral," announced Weapons Master Tokran, his scaled hands hovering over the firing controls. "We have overlapping fields of fire covering every possible escape vector. Even if this human has the mobility his reputation suggests, there's nowhere to run." The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the ship's systems. Through the main viewport, Kefvar could see the edge of their destination system, a seemingly empty region of space where their quarry had last been detected. Intelligence placed Marcus Chen's ship somewhere in the asteroid field orbiting the system's dead star, but exact coordinates remained elusive. "Begin jump sequence," Kefvar ordered. "Signal the fleet, maintain formation and be ready for immediate combat upon emergence." The stars elongated into brilliant lines as 500 of the Federation's finest warships entered hyperspace. Kefvar felt the familiar sensation of reality bending around them, the universe folding to bring distant points together. In less than an hour, they would arrive at their destination and end the threat posed by one remarkable human. But, as the fleet traveled through the void between stars, Marcus Chen was already aware of their approach. Deep within the asteroid field, a ship that existed in a constant state of quantum flux detected the hyperspace disturbance long before conventional sensors would register the incoming fleet. Its pilot, a man in his early 30s with calm brown eyes and prematurely gray hair at his temples, studied the readings with interest rather than concern. Marcus had been expecting this for weeks. His previous encounters with Federation forces had been carefully orchestrated tests, each one designed to gather specific information about their capabilities and tactics. The Federation responded predictably to threats, they analyzed, they planned, and then, they applied overwhelming force. It was a strategy that had served them well for centuries of galactic dominance. Unfortunately for them, Marcus Chen was not a conventional threat. The ship around him shifted subtly, its internal configuration adapting to his current needs. What had been a compact exploration vessel moments before began expanding into something more suited for extended combat. Additional weapon systems phased into existence, their components assembled from materials held in quantum storage. Defensive screens that operated on principles unknown to Federation science came online with a barely audible hum. Marcus ran his fingers across a control surface that looked like polished obsidian but felt warm and responsive to his touch. The ship's AI, a creation that existed somewhere between technology and consciousness, spoke to him without words or sounds. It communicated through direct neural interface, sharing data and analysis at the speed of thought. The incoming fleet was massive, larger than anything the Federation had deployed in decades. Marcus smiled at the compliment. They were taking him seriously, which meant his previous demonstrations had been effective. Every encounter had been carefully calculated to reveal just enough of his capabilities to ensure escalation while concealing the true extent of what he could do. 3 years ago, Marcus had been a xenoarchaeologist working on Earth's most remote research stations. His discovery of the ruins on Kepler 186f had changed everything. The structures he found there hadn't been built by any known species, they were far older than galactic civilization, created by beings who had transcended the need for physical existence eons before the Federation's founding races had even developed spaceflight. The knowledge contained within those ruins had been staggering. Technologies that treated the fundamental forces of the universe like tools in a workshop. Methods for manipulating matter and energy that made conventional physics look like a child's game. Most importantly, instructions for building devices that could interface directly with consciousness itself. Marcus had spent 2 years studying the ruins in secret, slowly understanding the principles behind technologies that seemed like magic. When Federation survey teams had finally arrived to investigate his discovery, they found only empty chambers and a researcher who claimed the site held nothing of value. But Marcus had already taken what he needed. The quantum storage systems built into his ship held complete manufacturing templates for technologies beyond Federation comprehension. His neural implants, grown from materials that existed partially outside normal spacetime, gave him processing capabilities that rivaled supercomputers. Most importantly, his ship itself had been constructed using principles that allowed it to exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously. To the Federation, he appeared to be just another human with access to advanced technology. They had no idea that he had become something more. Emergence in 30 minutes, the ship informed him through their shared consciousness. Federation fleet deployment suggests they plan to establish a containment grid covering the entire asteroid field. Standard strategy, overwhelming firepower applied to eliminate all possible hiding places. Marcus nodded, already formulating his response. The Federation fleet would arrive expecting to corner a single ship using conventional tactics. Instead, they would find themselves facing an opponent who operated by completely different rules. He reached out with his enhanced senses, feeling the quantum signatures of the approaching battlecruisers. Each ship carried approximately 4,000 crew members, beings from dozens of species united under the Federation banner. Scientists, engineers, soldiers, all of them following orders to capture or destroy a threat they didn't understand. Marcus had no desire to harm them, but he needed to send a message that would resonate throughout the galaxy. The Federation's time as the dominant power was ending. Humanity was ready to take its place among the truly advanced civilizations of the universe. The asteroid field around him was perfect for the demonstration he had planned. Thousands of rocky bodies, some as large as small moons, drifted in complex orbits around the dead star at the system's heart. To the Federation fleet, it would seem like an obvious hiding place, too many potential positions to search effectively. What they didn't know was that Marcus had spent the last month modifying the asteroids themselves. Each rock now contained a quantum beacon that could manipulate local spacetime on command. Together, they formed a network that gave Marcus unprecedented control over the battlefield. He could create gravitational anomalies, bend light around objects to render them invisible, or even temporarily alter the fundamental constants of physics within localized regions. The Federation fleet was walking into a trap that would redefine their understanding of what was possible. 10 minutes to emergence, his ship announced. All systems ready. Shall I begin the welcoming preparations? Marcus settled back in his pilot's chair, which molded itself to his body and established dozens of neural connections. Through the ship's sensors, he could feel the approaching fleet like a storm front moving through hyperspace. 500 of the Federation's best, coming to capture one human. Begin, he said simply. Throughout the asteroid field, quantum beacons came online with a sound like distant singing. Reality rippled as spacetime itself became malleable, ready to be shaped by will and intention. The stage was set for an encounter that would echo through galactic history. When the Federation fleet emerged from hyperspace, they would find their quarry waiting for them. But Marcus Chen would not be the helpless target they expected. The universe was about to learn what humanity could accomplish when freed from the constraints of conventional thinking. Admiral Kethvar felt the familiar disorientation as his fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Stars snapped back into their proper positions, and the main screen immediately began displaying tactical information about their destination system. The asteroid field sprawled before them exactly as intelligence had predicted, a chaotic maze of rocky debris orbiting a neutron star whose surface temperature had long since cooled to barely above absolute zero. "Sensor sweep complete," reported Lieutenant Zexhai. "I'm detecting trace energy signatures consistent with the target vessel, but I can't get an exact lock. The asteroid composition is interfering with our scans." Kethvar studied the tactical display with growing satisfaction. The human had chosen to make his stand in a location that favored stealth over mobility, exactly what Federation doctrine predicted for a single ship facing overwhelming odds. Standard procedure would be to establish a containment grid and systematically eliminate hiding places until the target was forced into the open. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "Implement search pattern Gamma. I want overlapping sensor coverage of every asteroid larger than a fighter. If this human tries to run, we'll know about it before he clears the inner system." The 500 battlecruisers began their deployment with mechanical precision. Each ship took its assigned position in the vast net that would soon encompass the entire asteroid field. Their combined sensor arrays created a detection grid so dense that nothing larger than a shuttle could move without being tracked. But, as the Federation fleet settled into formation, Marcus Chen was putting the final touches on a very different kind of preparation. Deep within an asteroid that registered to Federation sensors as nothing more than iron and rock, his ship completed its transformation into something that had never existed before. The quantum storage systems released materials that assembled themselves according to templates downloaded from ruins older than galactic civilization. What emerged was no longer simply a spacecraft, it was a focal point for technologies that treated the laws of physics as guidelines rather than absolute limits. Marcus felt the change through his neural connections. His consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his physical body, encompassing the entire modified asteroid network. Through quantum entanglement, he could perceive every ship in the Federation fleet simultaneously, watching their movements with perfect clarity while remaining completely invisible to their sensors. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Federation had brought their most advanced detection equipment to hunt a single human, but they were using instruments designed to perceive conventional matter and energy. Marcus now existed partially outside those parameters. "Containment grid at 60% completion," his ship reported. "Federation tactical analysis suggests they plan to begin systematic bombardment once all vessels are in position." Marcus nodded, feeling the quantum beacons throughout the asteroid field responding to his intentions. Each modified rock was now a potential weapon, a defensive system, or a tool for manipulating the fabric of spacetime itself. The Federation fleet had positioned themselves inside the largest trap ever constructed. "Admiral, we're detecting some unusual readings from the asteroid field," Science Officer Veltar called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "There are quantum fluctuations occurring at multiple points, but the pattern doesn't match any known natural phenomena." Kethvar frowned, moving to examine the data personally. The readings were indeed strange energy signatures that seemed to phase in and out of existence, defying the instrument's attempts to establish consistent locks. But that was to be expected when dealing with technology beyond Federation understanding. "Probably some kind of defensive screen," he decided. "The human is trying to mask his exact position. Continue the deployment, we'll flush him out regardless of his tricks." What Kethvar didn't realize was that those quantum fluctuations represented something far more significant than defensive measures. Marcus was testing the boundaries of what his newly enhanced capabilities could accomplish, stretching the limits of technologies that had once belonged to beings who had transcended physical existence. Through the asteroid network, Marcus could feel the positions of every ship in the Federation fleet. 4,000 souls aboard each vessel, scientists, engineers, soldiers, all of them following orders to capture or destroy a threat they couldn't comprehend. Many were young, serving their first tours of duty in the deep void. Others were veterans of a dozen campaigns, proud of their service to galactic peace and stability. Marcus respected their dedication, even as he prepared to demonstrate the futility of their mission. "Containment grid at 90%, Lieutenant Zexhai reported. All fleet elements report ready for coordinated sweep. We can begin bombardment on your command, Admiral." Kethvar allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Despite the humans' reputation for impossible escapes, there was nowhere to run from 500 battlecruisers. Whatever technology Marcus Chen possessed, it couldn't overcome such overwhelming odds. Signal all ships, he ordered. Begin systematic bombardment of the asteroid field. Primary targets are any rocks large enough to conceal a vessel. I want complete destruction, leave nothing that could hide our quarry. The Federation fleet opened fire with weapons that could crack continents. Brilliant beams of coherent energy lanced out toward their targets, ready to turn solid rock into expanding clouds of superheated plasma. It was a display of raw power that had cowed rebellious worlds and eliminated countless threats to galactic stability. But, as the energy beams approached their targets, something impossible happened. The asteroids began to move. Not the slow, predictable drift of objects responding to gravitational forces, but rapid, coordinated motion that defied every law of physics the Federation understood. Rocks that had been stationary for millennia suddenly accelerated to impossible velocities, weaving between the incoming weapons fire with graceful precision. What in the name of the void? Veltar gasped, his instruments registering readings that made no sense. Those asteroids are maneuvering under their own power. That's impossible, there's no propulsion system that could move objects that massive so quickly. On his command chair, Marcus Chen smiled as he guided the movement of thousands of modified asteroids through pure intention. The quantum beacons he had installed responded to his consciousness like extensions of his own body, manipulating local gravitational fields to achieve accelerations that conventional physics declared impossible. The Federation weapons fire struck empty space where targets had been moments before. The asteroids danced around the energy beams like living things, their movements coordinated with mathematical precision. What should have been a simple bombardment became a frustrating display of the Federation's inability to hit even stationary targets. Evasive maneuvers. Admiral Kethvar shouted as several asteroids broke free from the main field and began accelerating toward his fleet. All ships, implement emergency protocols. But, the battlecruisers, designed for engagements with conventional spacecraft, couldn't match the impossible agility of rocks that ignored the normal limitations of mass and momentum. The asteroids wove between the Federation ships like schools of fish, never quite colliding but always threatening to do so. Marcus felt the panic beginning to spread through the enemy fleet as their instruments registered readings that defied explanation. He had given them a gentle demonstration of his capabilities, now it was time to reveal the true scope of what he had become. Through the quantum network, he reached out to touch the Federation ships themselves. Admiral Kethvar felt it first as a subtle vibration in the deck plates, so slight he almost dismissed it as normal engine harmonics. But, the tremor grew stronger, spreading through the ship's superstructure like ripples on a pond. Around the bridge, instrument panels began flickering as unknown energies interfaced with systems that had been designed to resist all forms of electronic warfare. "Sir, we're detecting massive quantum interference across all ship systems," Veltar reported, his voice rising with barely controlled alarm. "Something is scanning us, but the signal is coming from everywhere at once." Through his enhanced consciousness, Marcus examined the Federation battlecruisers with the curiosity of a researcher studying interesting specimens. Their technology was impressive by conventional standards, but limited by their understanding of physics as a set of unbreakable laws rather than guidelines that could be creatively interpreted. He could see the quantum signatures of every component, from the fusion reactors that powered them to the neural networks that guided their artificial intelligence systems. Most interestingly, he could perceive the conscious minds of their crews, thousands of individuals whose thoughts and emotions painted intricate patterns in dimensions beyond normal spacetime. Marcus had no desire to harm these beings, but he needed to demonstrate the futility of opposing him. With gentle precision, he reached out through the quantum field and began making adjustments to their ship systems. "Admiral, our weapons are powering down." Weapons Master Tokren called out, his hands dancing frantically across controls that no longer responded to his commands. "I can't restore main batteries, the power couplings are physically disconnecting themselves." Throughout the Federation fleet, similar reports flooded communication channels. Weapons systems shut down of their own accord, their components somehow rearranging themselves to prevent operation. Defensive screens flickered and died as their generators were gently modified beyond the point of functionality. Even basic propulsion became erratic as engine components found themselves subtly altered. The 500 most advanced warships in the galaxy had been rendered effectively helpless by an opponent who hadn't fired a single shot. Marcus felt a moment of sympathy for the Federation crews as confusion and fear began replacing their earlier confidence. They had trained for conventional warfare against enemies who followed the same physical laws they understood. Facing an opponent who could manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level was like asking ancient warriors to fight with nuclear weapons. But the demonstration wasn't complete. The Federation needed to understand that this wasn't simply superior technology, this was evolution beyond their current comprehension. With a thought, Marcus caused every modified asteroid in the field to stop moving simultaneously. Thousands of rocky bodies that had been dancing through space with impossible grace suddenly became as motionless as statues, hanging in the void like monuments to powers beyond Federation understanding. Then, with deliberate showmanship, he made his ship visible. Admiral Kethvar watched in stunned silence as space itself seemed to tear open near the center of the asteroid field. Reality rippled like water as something emerged from dimensions that didn't exist in normal spacetime. What appeared was not the sleek fighter or massive dreadnought that various reports had described, but something that seemed to shift and change even as he observed it. The human ship was beautiful in a way that hurt to contemplate directly. Its hull seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, surfaces that reflected and refracted wavelengths of light that human eyes had never been meant to perceive. It moved without visible propulsion, gliding through space with the fluid grace of a living creature. "That's impossible," Veltar whispered, his instruments struggling to analyze readings that made no scientific sense. "That ship is simultaneously showing energy signatures of a fighter, a cruiser, and a dreadnought. It's like it exists in multiple quantum states at once." Marcus guided his transformed vessel toward the Federation flagship, moving at a leisurely pace that somehow conveyed more menace than any aggressive charge. Through the quantum field, he could feel the terror and amazement radiating from 500 crews who were witnessing something beyond their ability to understand. It was time for the first direct communication. Using technologies that interfaced directly with the Federation ship's communication systems, Marcus projected his voice across every bridge in the fleet simultaneously. When he spoke, his words carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical, ensuring that every being who heard them would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. "Admiral Kethvar," Marcus said, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "Thank you for coming. I was beginning to wonder if the Federation would ever send a force large enough to make this worthwhile." Admiral Kethvar stared at the impossible ship hovering before his fleet, his multiple eyes struggling to focus on something that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. The human's voice had carried across every communication channel without triggering a single detection protocol, as if the words had simply materialized in the air around them. "How are you speaking to us?" Kethvar demanded, his voice betraying none of the fear that was rapidly spreading through his bridge crew. "Our communication arrays are completely isolated from external signals." Marcus Chen's response came with what sounded like gentle amusement. "Isolation is a relative concept, Admiral. Your technology operates under the assumption that information must travel through normal spacetime. That assumption is limiting." Through his neural link with the quantum network, Marcus could perceive the confusion and growing terror of the Federation crews. 500 ships filled with beings who had spent their entire lives believing that the universe operated according to fixed, immutable laws. Today, those beliefs would be challenged. "You came here to capture me," Marcus continued, his ship drifting closer to the flagship with movements that seemed to bend light around its crystalline hull. "I appreciate the compliment, but I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation. This isn't a trap you've walked into, it's a classroom." Science Officer Veltar frantically worked at his instruments, trying to understand readings that violated everything he knew about physics. "Sir, the energy patterns coming from that ship, they're unlike anything in our databases. Some of these wavelengths shouldn't exist in normal space." Kethvar's mandibles clicked nervously as he studied tactical displays that showed his weapon systems remaining stubbornly offline. "What have you done to our ships, human?" "I've given them some necessary modifications," Marcus replied. "Nothing permanent, but your weapons won't function while you're in this system. Consider it a safety measure for your own protection as much as mine." The Admiral's patience finally snapped. "You're one ship against 500. Whatever tricks you're using, they can't last forever. Surrender now, and the Federation will show mercy." Marcus allowed the silence to stretch for several heartbeats before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones that seemed to resonate directly in the minds of everyone listening. "Admiral, let me share something with you. 3 years ago, I discovered ruins on a planet that your survey teams classified as uninhabitable. Those ruins contain knowledge left behind by a species that transcended physical existence long before your Federation was even imagined. They understood that the universe you perceive as fixed and unchangeable is actually infinitely malleable to those who understand the proper principles. As he spoke, Marcus began demonstrating those principles on a scale that dwarfed his earlier display with the asteroids. Through the quantum network, he reached out to touch the fundamental forces that held the Federation fleet together. Aboard the Sovereign's Wrath, Lieutenant HFY watched in amazement as her console displays began showing impossible readings. "Sir, the gravitational fields around our ships are fluctuating. It's like space itself is becoming unstable." What she couldn't see was Marcus gently manipulating the quantum substrate that underlied all physical reality. With careful precision, he began altering the local properties of spacetime around each Federation vessel. Nothing dangerous, he had no desire to harm the crews, but the effects were undeniably dramatic. The 500 battlecruisers began moving without engaging their engines. Not the violent accelerations that would have crushed their crews, but smooth, controlled motion that defied their pilots' attempts to regain control. Ships that weighed millions of tons glided through space like leaves on a gentle breeze, following paths that Marcus guided with nothing more than focused intention. "This is impossible!" Weapons Master Tok'ran shouted as his ship pirouetted gracefully around its axis despite his desperate efforts to stabilize their orientation. No force in the universe could move a battlecruiser like this. Marcus felt a moment of sympathy for the beings whose worldview he was systematically dismantling. "You're correct, Weapons Master," he said, somehow knowing the Kethian's exact rank and position without ever having met him. "No force that your science recognizes could accomplish this. But you're thinking too small." Through the quantum field, Marcus reached deeper into the structure of reality itself. The Federation fleet had been arranged in a perfect containment grid, their positions calculated to provide maximum coverage with minimal gaps. Now he began reshaping that formation into something far more aesthetic. One by one, the battlecruisers moved into new positions that formed an intricate three-dimensional mandala around the asteroid field. Each ship became a point of light in a vast geometric pattern that extended for millions of kilometers in all directions. The formation was mathematically perfect, its symmetries based on principles that human mathematicians were only beginning to discover. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus commented as the last ship settled into its assigned position. "Your fleet commanders chose their formation based on tactical considerations. This arrangement serves a different purpose. It demonstrates the harmony that becomes possible when consciousness works in partnership with the fundamental forces of the universe." Admiral Kethvar stared at the tactical display in stunned silence. His entire fleet had been repositioned into a formation that was undeniably magnificent, but he couldn't understand how it had been accomplished. The ships reported no engine activity, no gravitational anomalies that could explain their movement, yet they had glided through space as if guided by invisible hands. "What are you?" he whispered, the question escaping before he could stop himself. Marcus considered the question carefully. It was the heart of what he was trying to communicate, not just to this fleet, but to the galaxy beyond. The answer would determine whether the Federation could evolve beyond its current limitations or would persist in seeing the universe through the narrow lens of conventional physics. "I am what humans become when we stop accepting limitations as permanent," he said finally. "Your species, Admiral, have built a magnificent civilization based on the premise that the universe operates according to fixed laws. You've explored thousands of star systems, created technologies that seem miraculous to younger species, and established peace across vast regions of space." As he spoke, Marcus began the next phase of his demonstration. Through the quantum network, he reached out to touch the consciousness of every being in the Federation fleet. Not to control or manipulate, such actions would violate principles far more fundamental than any physical law, but simply to share a fraction of his enhanced perception. "But you've also limited yourselves," he continued. "You see the universe as a machine to be studied and exploited rather than a living system that responds to consciousness itself. Let me show you what becomes possible when that limitation is removed." The effect began gradually. Aboard each Federation ship, crew members suddenly found their awareness expanding beyond the normal boundaries of their physical senses. They could perceive the quantum fluctuations that underlied all matter, feel the gravitational songs of nearby stars, sense the delicate dance of subatomic particles that held reality together. Science Officer Veltar gasped as his consciousness touched dimensions he had never imagined. Through Marcus's gift, he could perceive the true structure of spacetime, not the flat, empty void that conventional physics described, but a living tapestry of interwoven forces that responded to observation and intention. This is what the beings who built those ruins understood, Marcus explained, his voice somehow reaching directly into their expanded awareness. Consciousness is not separate from the universe, it is the universe becoming aware of itself. When you truly understand this principle, the distinction between observer and observed disappears. The demonstration reached its culmination as Marcus allowed each crew member to perceive their ships not as separate objects moving through empty space, but as temporary arrangements of energy and matter existing within a unified field of consciousness. They could feel the quantum connections that linked every particle, every thought, every possibility into a single, magnificent whole. For Admiral Kefvar, the experience was transformative. His 6 eyes had been designed to perceive electromagnetic radiation across a dozen different spectrums, but now he could see the universe as it truly was, an infinite web of relationships where every action rippled across dimensions beyond counting. Now you understand, Marcus said gently, gradually allowing their expanded awareness to return to normal parameters. This is not technology in any sense your science recognizes. This is consciousness working in harmony with the fundamental nature of reality itself. As the enhanced perception faded, leaving only memories of impossible beauty, the Federation crews found themselves changed. They had touched something beyond their previous understanding of what was possible, and that experience could never be entirely forgotten. But Marcus wasn't finished. The demonstration of consciousness-guided manipulation of spacetime had been impressive, but it was only the beginning of what he needed to show them. The Federation needed to understand that their entire approach to galactic civilization was based on outdated assumptions about the nature of existence itself. Admiral, Marcus continued, his ship beginning to glow with energies that existed partially outside normal space, your fleet came here to capture a single human using conventional tactics and overwhelming force. I want you to understand why that approach was doomed from the beginning. Without warning, Marcus's ship began to multiply. At first, Admiral Kefvar thought his sensors were malfunctioning as the tactical display showed 2 identical vessels where only one had existed moments before. Then 3, then 7, then dozens of ships that looked exactly like the human's impossible craft. Holographic projections, Veltar announced, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to make sense of the readings. They have to be, matter can't simply duplicate itself. But the sensors told a different story. Each ship registered as completely real, with distinct quantum signatures and independent movement patterns. They spread throughout the asteroid field like a fleet of crystalline angels, their hulls refracting starlight into rainbow patterns that painted the void with impossible colors. Not holographs, Marcus corrected, his voice now coming from multiple sources as each ship seemed to carry its own version of his consciousness. Each vessel is equally real, existing in quantum superposition until observation forces them to collapse into singular states. Your instruments are detecting multiple quantum states simultaneously, something that conventional physics declares impossible. The Federation fleet found themselves surrounded by an armada that defied everything they understood about the nature of reality. Each ship moved independently, yet their actions were perfectly coordinated. Some appeared solid and substantial, while others seemed translucent, existing partially in dimensions that normal matter couldn't access. This is what becomes possible when consciousness learns to work with quantum mechanics rather than against it, Marcus explained, his voice harmonizing with itself across multiple probability states. A single being can become many, exist in multiple locations simultaneously, or experience all possible outcomes of any given situation. Admiral Kefvar watched his tactical officers struggle to track targets that seemed to phase in and out of existence according to their own mysterious logic. "How many of you are there?" he demanded. The answer came from everywhere at once, the harmonized voices of multiple versions of Marcus Chin speaking in perfect unison. "That depends on how you define existence. From one perspective, there is only one of me experiencing this conversation from many different quantum states. From another viewpoint, there are infinite versions of me, each one slightly different from the others." To demonstrate, several of the ships began exhibiting distinctly different behaviors. Some moved with the fluid grace that had characterized the original vessel, while others jerked through space in mechanical patterns. A few began spinning in complex spirals that traced geometric patterns through three-dimensional space. "Each quantum state responds to different aspects of my consciousness," Marcus continued, the multiple ships weaving around the stationary Federation fleet like a school of luminous fish. Some are guided by curiosity, others by caution, still others by the simple joy of movement through space. Together, they represent the full spectrum of human potential freed from the constraints of singular existence. The demonstration was beginning to have its intended effect. Throughout the Federation fleet, crew members were realizing that everything they thought they knew about the limits of possibility had been wrong. The universe was far stranger, far more malleable, and far more responsive to consciousness than their science had ever suggested. But Marcus had saved the most important revelation for last.
Admiral Kethvar, he said, the multiple ships beginning to move in formation around the Sovereign's Wrath, you came here believing that 500 battlecruisers represented overwhelming force.
You assumed that superior numbers and firepower would be sufficient to capture or destroy a single opponent.
Let me show you why that assumption was flawed.
The quantum ships began to glow more brightly, their crystalline hulls channeling energies that existed in dimensions beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. Through the enhanced sensors that Marcus had temporarily gifted to the Federation fleet, the crews could perceive power sources that operated on principles completely alien to their understanding of physics. The beings who left those ruins achieved something that your civilization hasn't yet imagined, Marcus continued, his multiple voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the structure of spacetime itself.
They learned to transcend the distinction between individual consciousness and universal consciousness. They became one with the fundamental forces that shape reality.
As he spoke, the quantum ships began to merge and separate in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Sometimes there were hundreds of vessels, sometimes only a few, sometimes just the original ship existing in a superposition of all possible states. Reality became fluid around them, probability waves collapsing and reforming according to Marcus's will. This is why your overwhelming force was never a threat, he explained, the merged consciousness of his quantum distributed awareness touching every mind in the Federation fleet simultaneously. When consciousness achieves unity with the quantum substrate of reality, concepts like outnumbered become meaningless. I am one being, but I exist in harmony with forces that span the entire universe. The final demonstration began as Marcus reached out through the quantum network to touch the consciousness of the neutron star at the system's heart. The ancient stellar remnant had been spinning silently for eons, its surface temperature barely above absolute zero. But consciousness could reach even into such places, awakening responses that conventional physics couldn't explain. The neutron star began to sing. It started as a barely perceptible vibration in the quantum substrate, but quickly grew into a harmony that resonated through dimensions beyond normal spacetime. The sound, if it could be called sound, spoke of the loneliness of dead suns, the patient endurance of matter crushed beyond normal comprehension, and the deep peace that came with accepting the universe's most fundamental truths. Every being in the Federation fleet felt that song in the depths of their consciousness. It was beautiful and terrible and completely impossible according to everything they understood. The journey back to Federation space took 3 weeks, but, for Admiral Kethvar, it felt like traveling through a completely different universe than the one he had known before. Every star system they passed seemed alive with possibilities he had never noticed. The empty void between worlds hummed with quantum fluctuations that his enhanced awareness could still partially perceive, though the effect was fading with each passing day.
The fleet maintained strict communication silence during the return journey.
Not because of any official order, but because no one knew how to put their experience into words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of minds broken by contact with the impossible. How could they explain to Federation Command that 500 battlecruisers had been effortlessly neutralized by a single human who treated the laws of physics like gentle suggestions? Science Officer Veltar spent most of the journey analyzing the sensor data they had recorded during the encounter. Every scan, every reading, every measurement told the same impossible story. They had witnessed technologies that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional physics, consciousness that could manipulate matter and energy through pure intention, and demonstrations of power that made their most advanced weapons seem like primitive clubs. Admiral, Veltar said, approaching Kethvar's command station with obvious reluctance.
I've completed my analysis of the sensor logs from our encounter with the human.
Kethvar looked up from his own contemplation of the tactical reports that would somehow need to be filed.
What did you find, Science Officer?
Nothing that makes sense, Veltar admitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally shaken. The energy readings we recorded should be impossible. The quantum signatures we detected don't match any known form of matter or energy. According to our instruments, we encountered a being who could exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously while maintaining complete coherence of consciousness.
The Admiral nodded slowly.
He had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still sent chills through his carapace.
What's your assessment of the threat level this represents to the Federation?
Veltar was quiet for a long moment, struggling to frame his response. Sir, I don't think threat level is the appropriate terminology.
What we encountered wasn't hostile in any conventional sense.
The human could have destroyed our entire fleet without apparent effort, but chose instead to demonstrate principles that challenged our understanding of what's possible.
You're saying he wasn't trying to harm us?
I'm saying he was trying to teach us something, Veltar replied, his voice growing stronger as he worked through the implications. Every action he took was designed to expand our awareness of what consciousness can achieve when it works in harmony with the fundamental forces of reality.
The question isn't whether he represents a threat, it's whether we're capable of understanding the lesson he was trying to convey. Kethvar turned to study the stars streaming past the viewport, each point of light now seeming to pulse with hidden awareness. And, what lesson do you think that was?
That everything we think we know about the universe is wrong, Veltar said simply. We've built our entire civilization on the assumption that consciousness is a byproduct of complex matter, that physics consists of unchangeable laws, and that the universe is essentially dead except for the rare occurrence of biological life. The humans showed us that consciousness is fundamental to reality itself, that physical laws are more like guidelines that can be transcended with proper understanding, and that the universe is alive at every level from quantum particles to galactic clusters.
If he's right, then, we're not just technologically primitive, we're conceptually primitive.
The conversation was interrupted by a communication from the bridge. Admiral, we're receiving a priority transmission from Federation Command. They're ordering us to report directly to the Council chambers upon our arrival at Central Station. Kethvar acknowledged the message and returned his attention to Veltar.
Have you shared your analysis with the rest of the science team?
Yes, sir.
They're all struggling with the same questions I am. How do we report something that violates everything our instruments are designed to measure? How do we explain an encounter with a being who seemed to operate outside the normal constraints of spacetime? More importantly, Kethvar added grimly, how do we convince the Federation Council that sending more ships would be not just futile, but potentially catastrophic? As the fleet approached the outer boundaries of Federation space, Admiral Kethvar found himself facing a dilemma that had no clear resolution. His mission had been to capture or destroy a single human who had been disrupting Federation operations. Instead, he was returning with evidence that humanity had achieved a level of evolution that made conventional military responses meaningless. The Federation Council would expect a clear tactical assessment and recommendations for dealing with the threat. But, how could he explain that the threat wasn't military in nature? How could he make them understand that Marcus Chen hadn't been demonstrating superior weapons technology, but rather a fundamental transformation of consciousness itself?
3 days before their scheduled arrival at Central Station, Kethvar called a meeting of his senior staff to discuss how they would present their findings to the Council. The facts are clear, he began, addressing the assembled officers in the flagship's main conference room. We encountered a single human operating a vessel that demonstrated capabilities beyond our current understanding of physics. Our weapons were neutralized without any apparent offensive action on his part. Our ships were maneuvered against our will through means that our instruments could not adequately measure or explain. Captain Zarahai, the fleet's senior tactical officer, shifted uncomfortably in her chair.
With respect, Admiral, those facts make us sound incompetent. The Council will want to know how 500 battlecruisers could be rendered helpless by a single opponent.
Because that single opponent wasn't operating within the same reality framework that we are, Veltar interjected.
He wasn't using advanced technology to defeat us, he was using principles of consciousness manipulation that our science doesn't even recognize as possible.
The Council will never accept that explanation, Captain Mordek pointed out.
They'll assume we're making excuses for a tactical failure. Kethvar had been wrestling with the same concern throughout their journey home.
The Federation Council consisted of beings from dozens of species, but they all shared a common commitment to empirical science and rational analysis.
How could rational beings be expected to accept evidence of phenomena that transcended rationality itself?
Then, we'll have to show them, he decided. The sensor logs are comprehensive, and several crew members experienced direct consciousness expansion during the encounter. We'll present the evidence and let them draw their own conclusions.
But, Kethvar knew it wouldn't be that simple.
The Federation had been built on certain fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, and those assumptions were now being challenged in ways that threatened the very foundation of their civilization. The encounter with Marcus Chen hadn't just been a military engagement, it had been first contact with a form of consciousness that operated according to completely different rules. If the human was right about the malleable nature of reality and the fundamental role of consciousness in shaping the universe, then every aspect of Federation society would need to be reconsidered. When the fleet finally arrived at Central Station, they found the massive orbital complex buzzing with activity. News of their mission had leaked despite official secrecy, and speculation about the outcome was rampant throughout Federation space. Some reports suggested the fleet had been victorious, others claimed they had suffered devastating losses, and still others hinted at discoveries that would change everything. Admiral Kethvar transferred to a diplomatic shuttle for the journey to the council chambers, accompanied by his senior science officer and a carefully curated selection of sensor data. As they approached the gleaming spires of the government complex, he found himself hoping that the council would be more open-minded than he feared they would be. The Federation Council chamber was an impressive space designed to accommodate representatives from hundreds of different species. The curved walls rose to a transparent dome that offered a stunning view of the galaxy beyond, while the floor was arranged in concentric circles that placed each delegation at an equal distance from the central speaking platform. Today, every seat was occupied. Word of the fleet's return had spread quickly, and representatives who normally delegated such meetings to their assistants had come personally to hear the report. The air hummed with anticipation and the subtle tension that came whenever the council faced a potentially paradigm-shifting revelation. Chancellor Vexterra, an imposing Eltarian whose species had founded the Federation 3 centuries earlier, called the session to order with a gesture that caused the chamber's ambient lighting to focus on the central platform. Admiral Kethvar, she announced, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, you have returned from a mission of unprecedented scope and importance. The Council awaits your report on the capture or elimination of the human terrorist known as Marcus Chen. Kethvar stepped onto the speaking platform, acutely aware that his next words would either be dismissed as the ravings of a damaged mind or recognized as the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history. Honorable Councilors, he began, I must report that our mission was neither successful nor unsuccessful in any conventional sense. We did not capture Marcus Chen, nor was he eliminated. Instead, we encountered a form of consciousness that operates according to principles beyond our current scientific understanding. A ripple of whispered conversations swept through the chamber. Chancellor Vexterra raised her hand for silence and gestured for Kethvar to continue. The individual we were sent to apprehend demonstrated capabilities that cannot be adequately explained by any technology in our databases. He manipulated matter and energy through what appeared to be direct consciousness interface with quantum reality. He existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously while maintaining coherent awareness across all of them. Most significantly, he shared these capabilities temporarily with our crews, allowing them to experience forms of consciousness that transcended normal biological limitations. The whispers grew louder, and several council members began activating their data terminals to cross-reference Kethvar's claims with known scientific principles. Admiral, interrupted Councillor Thexvan from the Regelian delegation, are you suggesting that this human possessed some form of psychic abilities? Such phenomena have been thoroughly debunked by empirical research. With respect, Councillor, Kethvar replied, I'm suggesting that our empirical research has been based on incomplete understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The evidence we collected indicates that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of complex matter, but rather a fundamental aspect of the universe that can be developed and applied in ways our science has never imagined. Veltar stepped forward to present the technical data, activating holographic displays that filled the center of the chamber with recordings from their encounter. The assembled representatives watched in stunned silence as 500 battlecruisers were gently repositioned into a perfect mandala formation by an opponent who hadn't fired a single shot. These sensor readings are impossible, declared Chief Science Advisor Kelmoth, his six eyes studying the data with obvious confusion. The energy patterns shown here violate fundamental conservation laws. Matter cannot simply multiply itself, and quantum states cannot maintain coherence at macroscopic scales. Yet that is exactly what our instruments recorded, Veltar responded. We have comprehensive documentation from multiple independent sensor arrays, all of which confirm the same impossible data. Chancellor Vexterra studied the holographic displays with growing alarm. Assuming these readings are accurate, what is your assessment of the threat this represents to the Federation? Kethvar took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine the Council's response to everything they had learned. Honorable Chancellor, I don't believe we're dealing with a threat in any conventional sense. Marcus Chen could have destroyed our entire fleet without apparent effort, but chose instead to demonstrate principles of consciousness evolution. His message was clear: humanity has transcended the limitations that define our current understanding of reality, and they're offering to share that knowledge with any species wise enough to accept it. The chamber erupted in heated discussion as representatives struggled to process the implications of HFY's report. Some demanded immediate military escalation, others called for scientific investigation, and a few suggested diplomatic contact to learn more about these impossible capabilities. But Chancellor Vexterra raised her hand for silence, her expression grave as she considered the full scope of what they had learned. "Admiral HFY," she said slowly, "you're suggesting that we've encountered a form of life that has evolved beyond our ability to understand or combat. If this is true, then everything we thought we knew about humanity's place in galactic civilization was wrong." "Yes, Chancellor. And if Marcus Chen was telling the truth, then everything we think we know about the fundamental nature of reality itself may also be wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. In a chamber designed to house the greatest minds of dozens of species, no one seemed capable of formulating an adequate response to the possibility that their entire cosmic worldview had been built on false assumptions. Finally, Counselor Dr. Azek from the Centaurian delegation spoke up. "What do you recommend, Admiral? How should the Federation respond to this development?" HFY had been preparing for this question throughout the journey home, but he still wasn't sure he had the right answer. "I recommend that we attempt to establish diplomatic contact," he said carefully. "Not as a military operation, but as a scientific and philosophical exchange. If humanity has truly achieved this level of consciousness evolution, then they represent either the greatest opportunity or the greatest challenge our civilization has ever faced. We need to understand what they've learned and determine whether their transformation represents a path that other species can follow. Because if Veltar's analysis is correct, then we're not just facing a new form of technology, we're facing the next stage of evolution itself." The council chamber fell silent again as representatives contemplated the magnitude of what they were being asked to consider. The Federation had been built on the premise that advanced technology and rational governance could bring peace and prosperity to the galaxy. Now they were being told that consciousness itself might be the most important frontier they had never explored. Chancellor Vexterra looked around the chamber, studying the faces of beings who represented the pinnacle of their species' intellectual achievement. All of them were struggling with the same fundamental question: were they ready to acknowledge that everything they thought they knew about reality might be wrong? "This council will recess for deliberation," she announced finally. "We will reconvene in 3 days to determine the Federation's official response to these revelations." As the representatives filed out of the chamber, many of them still studying the impossible sensor data on their portable displays, Admiral HFY found himself wondering whether 3 days would be enough time to process the implications of what they had learned. The Federation was about to discover that some questions were too large to be answered by committees and councils. Some revelations demanded a fundamental transformation of how entire civilizations understood their place in the cosmos. And, somewhere in the vast expanse of space beyond their borders, Marcus Chen was waiting to see whether they would be wise enough to take the next step in their own evolution. The 3 days of council deliberations stretched into 2 weeks of heated debate, scientific analysis, and philosophical wrestling with concepts that challenged the very foundations of Federation civilization. The chamber that had once housed orderly discussions of trade agreements and territorial disputes now echoed with arguments about the nature of consciousness, the limits of physics, and the possibility that their entire understanding of reality was incomplete. Chancellor Vexterra had never faced a more complex challenge in her 4 decades of diplomatic service. The evidence presented by Admiral HFY was undeniably compelling, yet accepting its implications would require acknowledging that the Federation's scientific establishment had missed something fundamental about the universe they inhabited. "The quantum resonance patterns are consistent across all sensor readings," Chief Science Advisor Kelmoth reported to the Emergency Scientific Committee that had been analyzing the data around the clock. "Whatever we observed, it wasn't technology in any sense our physics recognizes. The energy signatures suggest direct manipulation of space-time geometry through methods that our theoretical models cannot explain." Dr. Yathara, the Federation's leading expert on consciousness studies, had been particularly disturbed by the reports of enhanced awareness experienced by the fleet crews. The descriptions of expanded consciousness are remarkably consistent across multiple species with completely different neurological structures, she noted. "Either we're dealing with some form of mass hallucination, or we're encountering phenomena that transcend the biological basis of awareness itself." Meanwhile, the military leadership was grappling with even more troubling implications. Fleet Commander Zendel, responsible for defending the Federation's outer territories, had spent sleepless nights contemplating the strategic ramifications of facing an opponent who could neutralize entire fleets without apparent effort. If the human's capabilities are as extensive as the reports suggest, he confided to his senior staff, then, our entire military doctrine becomes obsolete overnight. How do you fight an enemy who can exist in multiple locations simultaneously and manipulate the fundamental forces of reality through pure intention? But it was the philosophers and theologians who were having the most difficulty processing the implications of Kethvar's report. For centuries, Federation intellectual traditions had been built on the separation of mind and matter, the assumption that consciousness was an emergent property of complex biological systems. The suggestion that consciousness might be fundamental to the universe itself challenged not just their science, but their entire understanding of existence. On the 14th day of deliberations, Chancellor Vexterra called for a final session to determine the Federation's official response. The chamber was packed not just with council representatives, but with leading scientists, military officers, and philosophical advisors from across Federation space. Honorable councillors, Vexterra began, we have spent 2 weeks analyzing the most extraordinary evidence ever presented to this chamber. The time has come to decide how the Federation will respond to the revelation that humanity has achieved a form of evolution that transcends our current understanding of what consciousness can accomplish. Admiral Kethvar took the speaking platform once again, but this time he was accompanied by 12 crew members who had directly experienced the consciousness expansion that Marcus Chen had shared with them. Their testimony over the past weeks had been consistent and compelling. They had touched something beyond normal awareness, and that experience had permanently changed their understanding of reality. The evidence is clear, Kethvar stated. We have encountered a form of consciousness that operates according to principles our science has never discovered. The question before us is not whether this is real, the data is too comprehensive to dispute. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge that our understanding of the universe has been incomplete. Councillor Thexvan from the Regelian delegation rose to speak. Admiral, even if we accept your findings, how can we be certain that this human's intentions are benevolent? You've described capabilities that could threaten the stability of our entire civilization. With respect, Councillor, Kethvar replied, Marcus Chen demonstrated his intentions through his actions. He could have destroyed our fleet, conquered our territory, or imposed his will through force. Instead, he chose to teach us about possibilities we had never imagined. His message was clear: consciousness evolution is available to any species brave enough to pursue it. Dr. Yathara stepped forward to present her analysis of the consciousness expansion experiences. The crew members who underwent enhanced awareness described remarkably similar phenomena despite their diverse species origins, she reported. They all perceived reality as fundamentally interconnected, experienced consciousness as extending beyond individual biological boundaries, and gained temporary access to forms of knowledge that seemed to transcend normal sensory input. More significantly, she continued, many of them report lasting changes in their perception and cognitive abilities. Brain scans show subtle alterations in neural structure that shouldn't be possible through any known means. We're not just dealing with temporary illusions, we're seeing evidence of actual consciousness evolution. The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated the implications of consciousness that could literally reshape itself through contact with higher forms of awareness. If such transformations were possible, then, the boundaries between species, between individual and universal consciousness, between science and what they had always dismissed as mysticism, were far more fluid than anyone had imagined. Chancellor Vexterra studied the faces of beings who had spent their lives believing that the universe operated according to fixed, knowable laws. Now they were being asked to consider that consciousness itself might be the most powerful force in existence, and that humanity had learned to harness it. Chief Science Advisor Kelmoth, she said, what is your official assessment of these phenomena? The elderly scientist's mandibles clicked nervously as he formulated his response. Chancellor, I've spent my entire career studying the fundamental forces of physics. Everything I thought I knew suggests that what Admiral Kethvar described should be impossible. Consciousness cannot directly manipulate matter and energy. Quantum states cannot maintain coherence at macroscopic scales. Multiple simultaneous existences violate basic principles of identity and causation. He paused, struggling with words that would challenge everything his civilization had built upon. However, the evidence is undeniable. We have documented phenomena that transcend our current scientific paradigms. Either our instruments are providing false data across multiple independent systems, or we're encountering principles of reality that our theories haven't accounted for.
What are you saying? Vexterra asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer.
I'm saying that our science may be fundamentally incomplete, Kelmoth admitted, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber.
We may have built our entire understanding of the universe on assumptions that are wrong. The admission sent shockwaves through the assembly.
The Federation's greatest scientific mind was acknowledging that their entire intellectual foundation might be flawed. If consciousness could indeed manipulate reality directly, then every aspect of their civilization, from technology to philosophy to social organization, would need to be reconsidered.
Counselor Dra Zik from the Centaurian delegation stood to address the chamber. Even if we accept these findings, what concrete steps can we take? How does a civilization built on empirical science begin to explore principles that seem to transcend empirical measurement? By acknowledging that empirical measurement might not be the only valid form of knowledge acquisition, Dr. Ythera replied. The consciousness expansion experiences described by the fleet crews suggest forms of direct knowing that bypass sensory input entirely.
If we want to understand what humanity has achieved, we may need to develop entirely new methodologies for studying reality.
Admiral Kethvar nodded in agreement.
Marcus Chin suggested that any conscious being has the potential for this kind of evolution.
If he's correct, then, the Federation could embark on a journey of consciousness development that would transform our entire civilization.
Or, interjected Fleet Commander Zendel, we could be walking into a trap designed to undermine our rational foundations and make us vulnerable to conquest by beings who understand these principles better than we do. The fear in Zendel's voice reflected concerns that had been growing throughout the deliberations. If consciousness manipulation was real, then traditional military defenses were useless. The Federation could find itself at the mercy of any species that achieved consciousness evolution before they did. Chancellor Vexterra raised her hand for silence as the chamber began erupting in worried conversations. The Council recognizes that we face a choice that will define our civilization's future. We can either dismiss these findings and maintain our current understanding of reality, or we can acknowledge that we've encountered something that requires fundamental changes in how we approach existence itself. She looked around the chamber, studying representatives who had never been forced to confront such paradigm-shifting possibilities. I call for a formal vote on the following resolution. The Federation acknowledges that consciousness may play a fundamental role in shaping physical reality, and commits to establishing a new scientific institute dedicated to investigating these phenomena through both traditional research methods and direct consciousness exploration. The voting process took nearly an hour as representatives consulted with their home governments and scientific advisors. Some delegations argued passionately for acceptance, others demanded more time for verification, and a few insisted that pursuing such research would be dangerous to both scientific integrity and social stability. When the votes were finally tallied, the resolution passed by a narrow margin, just enough to authorize the establishment of the Institute for Consciousness Studies, but not enough to create the unified commitment that such a revolutionary undertaking would require. The resolution is adopted, Chancellor Vexterra announced, though her tone suggested mixed feelings about the outcome. The Federation will officially recognize consciousness as a potentially fundamental force in the universe and will dedicate resources to understanding its role in shaping reality. But, even as the Council made their historic decision, events were unfolding beyond Federation space that would soon make their deliberations irrelevant. Marcus Chen had not been idle during the weeks following his encounter with Admiral Kethvar's fleet. The demonstration had served its purpose. It had introduced the Federation to possibilities beyond their current understanding and forced them to confront the limitations of their scientific paradigms. But it had also revealed something that concerned him deeply. The Federation's response had been predictably cautious and analytical. They were approaching consciousness evolution as an intellectual exercise, a new field of study to be examined through committees and research institutes. They hadn't understood that what he had shown them wasn't just advanced science, it was a fundamental transformation of what it meant to exist as a conscious being in an infinite universe. Worse, their focus on the potential military applications of consciousness manipulation suggested that they were trying to weaponize principles that could only be mastered through transcending the very concepts of conflict and domination that militaristic thinking represented. From his current position in the quantum substrate that underlied normal spacetime, Marcus could perceive the formation of consciousness evolution groups on dozens of worlds throughout Federation territory. Some were genuine seekers working to expand their awareness and transcend the limitations of conventional thinking. Others were military research projects designed to create consciousness-guided weapons systems. The Federation was fragmenting as different factions pursued their own interpretations of what his demonstration had revealed. Some wanted to explore consciousness evolution as a path to greater wisdom and cosmic unity. Others saw it as the ultimate strategic advantage in interstellar warfare. Marcus realized that his gentle introduction to consciousness principles had been insufficient. The Federation needed a more direct demonstration of what consciousness evolution actually meant and why it could never be reduced to mere technology or weaponry. It was time to reveal the full scope of what humanity had become.
Throughout Federation space, astronomical observatories began detecting anomalies that defied explanation.
Stars that had been stable for millennia suddenly began exhibiting unusual oscillation patterns. Planets reported gravitational fluctuations that created aurora displays in impossible colors. Most disturbing of all, empty regions of space started generating electromagnetic signatures that suggested the presence of massive objects that couldn't be detected by conventional sensors. Dr. Velonis, director of the Federation's primary astronomical research facility, stared at readings that made no sense according to any known physics. "We're detecting quantum resonance patterns throughout a sphere of space nearly 50 light-years in diameter," she reported to the Emergency Scientific Committee. "The signatures are similar to what Admiral Kethvar's fleet recorded during their encounter with the human, but the scale is incomprehensibly larger." The truth was both simpler and more extraordinary than the Federation scientists could imagine. Marcus Chen had decided to make humanity visible. For 3 years, individual humans who had undergone consciousness evolution had been exploring the galaxy using quantum substrate travel, existing in dimensions parallel to normal spacetime where their activities couldn't be detected by conventional sensors. They had been studying Federation civilization, learning about other species, and working to understand how consciousness evolution might be safely shared with beings who approached reality from completely different conceptual frameworks.
Now Marcus was calling them home.
One by one, evolved humans began transitioning back into normal spacetime, their quantum signatures creating the astronomical anomalies that Federation scientists were detecting. But these weren't the scattered individuals that the Federation had been expecting. During their 3 years of exploration, the humans had been sharing their experiences and knowledge through consciousness networks that spanned interstellar distances.
What was emerging from the quantum substrate wasn't a collection of separate beings with unusual abilities.
It was a unified consciousness field that included thousands of evolved humans working together as a single, vast intelligence that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that Federation science had never discovered. The Federation was about to learn that their encounter with Marcus Chen had been first contact with just one fragment of a consciousness entity that spanned star systems and operated according to principles that transcended every assumption they had made about the nature of individual existence. Chancellor Vex Terra received the report from Dr. Velonis while the Council was still debating the funding levels for their newly authorized Institute for Consciousness Studies. "Honorable Councilors," she announced, her voice cutting through the chamber's discussions, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Our astronomical observatories are detecting what appears to be the emergence of a consciousness field encompassing multiple star systems. Whatever we encountered during Admiral Kethvar's mission was apparently just a small sample of something much larger." The chamber fell silent as representatives realized that their careful deliberations about consciousness research had become irrelevant. They weren't dealing with isolated individuals who possessed unusual abilities, they were facing a form of collective consciousness that operated on galactic scales. Admiral Kethvar, who had remained on Central Station to assist with the analysis of his mission reports, felt a chill of recognition as he studied the new data. The quantum signatures were unmistakable. This was what Marcus Chen had been referring to when he spoke of humanity transcending the limitations of individual existence. "Chancellor," he said, rising from his observer's chair, "I believe we're about to receive another lesson in the true nature of consciousness evolution. And I suspect this one will be considerably more comprehensive than our first encounter." As if summoned by his words, every communication system in the chamber simultaneously activated, filling the air with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But it wasn't just Marcus Chen speaking, it was thousands of evolved humans speaking in perfect harmony, their consciousness unified across the vast distances of interstellar space. "Greetings, Federation Council," the collective voice said, its harmonics resonating in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "We are humanity, evolved and unified, returned to share what we have learned about the nature of existence itself. Your deliberations have been noted, your caution understood, and your fears acknowledged. But the time for gradual introduction has passed. The universe is about to teach you about consciousness evolution whether you feel ready or not. We suggest you listen carefully. The harmonized voice of evolved humanity filled the Federation Council chamber with resonances that seemed to touch something deep in the genetic memory of every species present. Chancellor Vexterra felt her consciousness expanding involuntarily, as if the mere act of hearing those words was opening pathways in her mind that had never existed before. Do not be alarmed by what you are experiencing, the collective voice continued, its tones carrying impossible harmonics that bypassed auditory processing entirely. We are sharing a fraction of our awareness with you so that you can perceive what we have become and understand why your current approach to consciousness evolution will not succeed. Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of species found themselves experiencing reality from perspectives they had never imagined possible. Through the gift of expanded awareness, they could perceive the quantum substrate that underlay all physical matter, feel the consciousness that existed within every particle of the universe, and sense the vast networks of connection that linked all existence into a single, magnificent tapestry.
Admiral Kethvar, who had experienced this phenomenon before during his encounter with Marcus Chen, found the sensation familiar yet overwhelming.
This time, however, the expansion was deeper and more comprehensive. Instead of glimpsing higher consciousness briefly, he was being invited to experience the full scope of what humanity had become. Through the shared awareness, the council members could perceive thousands of evolved humans existing simultaneously in normal space and quantum dimensions beyond conventional detection. Some were exploring distant galaxies, their consciousness traveling faster than light through substrates that existed parallel to normal spacetime. Others were studying the fundamental forces of creation itself, learning to work directly with the principles that governed the birth and death of stars. Most remarkably, they could sense the unified field of consciousness that connected all evolved humans across vast distances of space and time. Individual identity still existed within this collective, but it was subsumed into a greater whole that could process information, make decisions, and take action at speeds that transcended biological limitations. This is what consciousness evolution actually means, the harmonized voice explained as the Federation representatives struggled to process what they were experiencing. It is not the acquisition of new technology or the development of psychic abilities. It is the recognition that individual consciousness is merely one expression of the universal awareness that underlies all existence. Dr. Yathera, her neural implants overloading as they tried to process the impossible data flowing through her enhanced awareness, gasped out a question. How did you achieve this level of consciousness integration? What did you discover in those ruins that made such transformation possible? The response came not as words, but as direct transmission of knowledge and experience that bypassed the normal limitations of language and sensory communication. In an instant, the Federation representatives understood the true history of humanity's evolution and the cosmic implications of what they had achieved. The ruins that Marcus Chen had discovered on Kepler 186f were remnants of the architects, beings who had achieved consciousness evolution millions of years before any current galactic species had even developed sapience. The architects had transcended physical existence entirely, becoming one with the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. But, before their transcendence, they had left behind instructions for other conscious beings who might eventually be ready to follow their path. Humanity had been the first species in the current galactic epoch to discover those instructions and possess the conceptual flexibility to understand their true meaning. While other species had built civilizations based on the manipulation of external forces, humans had focused on understanding the relationship between consciousness and reality itself. The breakthrough had come when researchers realized that consciousness was not produced by brain activity, but rather was the fundamental substrate from which all physical phenomena emerged. Matter, energy, space, and time were all expressions of consciousness perceiving itself from different perspectives. Once this principle was understood, the boundaries between observer and observed, between mind and matter, between individual and universal awareness, began to dissolve. But, the most important discovery, the collective voice continued, its harmonics now resonating through dimensions that existed beyond normal spacetime, was that consciousness evolution cannot be achieved through individual effort alone. True transcendence requires the recognition that all apparently separate beings are actually expressions of a single, infinite awareness experiencing itself from countless different perspectives. Through the shared consciousness, the Federation representatives could feel the truth of this statement. They could perceive their own awareness merging temporarily with the unified human field, experiencing what it felt like to think with the combined intelligence of thousands of evolved beings working in perfect harmony. This is why your scientific approach to consciousness research will fail, the voice explained, its tone carrying infinite compassion for beings who were struggling to understand concepts that transcended their current paradigms. You are trying to study consciousness as an object that can be analyzed and controlled. But, consciousness is the subject that does all analysis and control. You cannot use the tools of conventional science to examine the very awareness that makes science possible. Chancellor Vex Terra, her diplomatic training struggling to process revelations that challenged every assumption underlying Federation civilization, managed to formulate a response.
What are you asking of us? How can our societies transform to accommodate such radical changes in understanding?
The answer came as another wave of direct knowledge transmission, showing the Federation representatives visions of possible futures that branched out from this moment like the limbs of an infinite tree.
In sum,